And I would ask that it's now being recorded. Yes, indeed. And I would also ask that you mute your microphones and turn off your videos. And if you have any questions, just to post them in the chat. Okay, thank you. Over to you, Valarie.
Thanks, Peter. And thank you very much for everyone that was able to join. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to share my screen, so I'm going to shut off my camera. I like to do things fairly informally, although oddly, I have a script to some extent because I want to make sure I stay on time and that I cover all of the points sufficiently. Oh, sorry, I'm just going to admit Tony Patterson has just joined us. Bear with me. Okay, so Tony's just connecting. I think we're good.
So Val, given your hosting at the moment, can you keep an eye from time to time on anybody who's waiting to get in?
I can.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to be multitasking like mad here, but I can do it. So thanks everybody. So yeah, so essentially my talk is on my research area. I've been researching Norbert Elias. I do say Elias, I do not say Elias. I'm one of those people, the Porsche people, who prefers to disambiguate his name to more of a Western pronunciation. So Norbert Elias, I started studying him about 10 years ago. And that was actually after I did my Masters of Terrorism Studies with St. Andrews. And I just got very interested in the sociological side of terrorism in general, more on the grouping layer or the social layer or the meso layer than the individual. So I wasn't rejecting the psychology behind why people join terrorist organizations and their behaviors and actions, but I just became very interested in the group aspect. So I got really turned on to processual sociology, which some may argue that Norbert Elias was the godfather of or grandfather of. And I pursued my master's in sociology on that footing, and now I'm doing my doctorate. So I'm doing an applied science doctorate with Royal Roads. So my focus with my research has been, and my dissertation will be on the synthesis of ideological violence and social figurations. So social figurations kind of originated with Norbert Elias, and this is a term that not a lot of people really understand. So I'm going to go through some of the salient points around that, and I'm going to explain how we go about establishing an affinity between incidents of ideological violence and the surrounding social conditions. So essentially what we're doing in the plainest speak possible, we're trying to look at the social conditions around the rises and falls of ideological violence and being able to capture those in a qualitative way, and potentially from an applied perspective, create policy, social policy that is preemptive or preventative. So essentially, I'm sure you know, ideological violence is not new. So it's woven its way through history for thousands and thousands of years, as many societies and nations. So it's a fringe phenomenon, social phenomenon, and we hold it distinct from legitimate acts of violence, state monopolies of violence, and violence and colonization, and most civil conflict, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Underscoring the elements of state sanction and legitimacy, we can easily identify with Seymour's 1975 phrase, "One man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist," as this exemplifies the conundrum of violence from social conflict. So I believe that all good research should start with a bold statement. So my bold statement is, we can no longer assume that terrorists of any stripe are merely young, naive, or marginalized and under the influence of embedded or more radicalized members. So essentially, relieving terrorism analysis of gender status and demographics and environmental, the environmental milieu around it allows us to focus on it is a social phenomenon rather than, as I was saying, an individual or psychological shift from accepted social values. So the individual analysis and assessment portion of this or lens is not dead, but it has been misplaced and I believe long exhausted on the sources of causality and social figurations and where humans group. This is the area that has been waiting for thorough analysis and a means to explore the waves of ideological violence. So just to point out, this photo is a photo of young female soldiers in the PYD. So it's a Syrian branch of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, and is connected with the YPG. So the context of this is very interesting because we're seeing no longer just male soldiers or male actors involved in some of these ideological groups. So first, just very quickly on the definition of ideological violence in my context, so in this context. So I describe it as a repertoire of actions aimed at inflicting physical or psychological damage or harm on non-combatant individuals and with the intention of preventing social change that does not align with the subject beliefs and values of that particular group. So these ideas and ideals form the basis of social operating principles that may be drawn by economic, political, religious principles, or secular theories or policies, and that may include liberalism, conservatism, socialism, communism, onward and onward. To that, for decades, modern scholars have really wrestled with identifying root causes of ideological violence. And after every single incident of ideological violence, the first question always is, what caused this particular individual or group to resort to mass violence? So while a seemingly logical focus for analysis, the answers are often sought from the psychology, demographics, experience, and environments of the individual attackers. And the problem with this has been that not only has it been, I would say, a singular causal focus, but this approach has sort of filtered down into not only how we see terrorist groups and terrorist activity, but it's essentially founded a number of our countering and preventing violent extremism programs, which has been fraught with human and civil rights criticisms. So I would suggest it now begs the question, is the individual level the only area to reveal elements that influence ideological violence? And considering how ideological violence manifests as a social phenomenon, its sociogenesis infers the existence of social elements from human interactions that warrant exploration. So that's Norbert. He's a good-looking man. He made me laugh in one of his interviews. Someone had asked him, a German journalist had asked him why he never married. And he said that the women were always jealous of his research. And I just thought that was really something. Norbert Elias was very, very committed to his work. So he was born in, 1897, and he was a very influential German sociology, and his research revolved around long-term historical processes that included, quote unquote, the history of violence. And this is understood as either a civilizing or destabilizing process. Elias has been described as the last, which is an interesting statement to make, great classical sociologist, linking together conceptual approaches from Durkheim, Marx, Weber, Simmel, and Freud. And Elias passed in 1990. So he wasn't without his critics. Elias was a prolific, sophisticated scholar, and he had a very unique skill for not only envisioning abstract layers of interconnected networks and patterns in individual interactions, but also alignments to multiple social events. So in part, Elias's voluminous writing and abstract concepts explains some of his critics' commentary, that he was Eurocentric, he was polarizing, overly complex, and sometimes vague. Worth noting too, Elias, so he started out his academic career in the School of Philosophy. So what caused that departure was his disagreement in his dissertation of the Kantian school, or the Kantian view. So when he moved into sociology, and this is essentially what contributed to or formed the new sociology or processual sociology, he carried with him still some aspects of his philosophical teachings and beliefs. So we start to see that in some of his work that I'll get into a little later. So focusing on a processual and relational approaches to social thought, such as individual, society, and structure agency, his central placement of the concept of habitus in sociology sought to explain social stability and change. So social habitus was very important in the works of Elias's civilizing process. So I'm just going to flip through here so you can see all of my points. I'm going to move down here a bit so I can cover this off thoroughly. So the civilizing process, so this slide just gives sort of a little bit of a snapshot of how we can understand the civilizing process. And I'm going to provide a couple of different views. So the civilizing process essentially is the processual analysis of how society and the psychology of humans create social changes over long periods of time. The contributing social elements to that are things like behaviors, and these can be construed as conflict, violence, human interaction, social interactions, bonding between people, values, beliefs, nature in general, and morals. So the civilizing process, so this was essentially based on the 17th century European social habitus that separated the lower and ruling classes. And I say separated, they wanted that separation. So the upper classes wanted to have very specific social codes and social habitus for their group to keep the lower classes out. So it was a very distinct demarcation between those two groups, and that is what contributed to state formation. So state formation, if we look at France and Germany and some of the other European countries, this was a very important, from Elias's perspective, a very important development in how those states came to be. So interactions, or as how Elias terms them, social figurations. So these are reflected in bonding and grouping of humans. So if you can kind of envision, there's sort of three layers. There's the lowest layer, which is the individual layer, which would be like the microsocial layer. There's a meso layer, which is where humans start to come together, form groups, bond, they interact. And then there's the macro layer, and that's where the state formation occurs. So it kind of percolates up from the individual to the grouping to the state formation layer. So social habitus, social codes, social controls, all of these things are very important in understanding the civilizing process. So the civilizing process, Elias published this in 1939, and it really only gained attention in 1969 when it was translated into English. A number of scholars, Manel, Vertigens, Dunning, worked with Elias before he passed away in 1990 to interpret his works post-translation, to clear up some of the criticism, but also to propagate and revitalize his theory. Elias posited that human interactions, so social figurations, develop social habitus, as in standards, as well as social codes, social controls, and self-regulation, and that this brought about long chain social change. And when we think about the phrase socially acceptable, what is socially acceptable, we can gain a bit of an appreciation for what Elias was talking about, because we can see how subjective this is based on the action, the group, and the individuals performing that action and the time period. So what is socially acceptable in one group between certain people, performed by a particular person in a particular time period, may be completely different if you shift any of those variables. So a few of Elias's words that I always found very interesting, very important to me, that really helped me understand his theory and encouraged me to continue on as an academic in his area. One of the statements he had made, one of the quotes he had made, which was to Hahn in 1982, is, "There's nothing on earth which has become what it is. No concept, no style, no art. You cannot come to grips with it without reconstructing the process of that becoming, which is not history." And so what Elias was talking about there is his use of what are called directional models, where he uses historical elements, not history, to determine directions in civilizing and decivilizing in that process view. Also, he said, it is the order of interweaving human impulses and strivings, this social order which determines the course of historical change. So again, this encapsulates what I just previously said about his civilizing process. The formulation of these standards goes undetected, I love this, with nothing remaining in their consciousness, in the individual's consciousness, except a vague residue. So it's really a blind process to us. And when you look at it from the processual perspective, it becomes much clearer. So an interesting set of quotes from Elias that again, it does point back to his philosophical start with his academic career, but obviously overlaid to the sociological or the new sociology as he referred to it. So the purpose of looking at the civilizing process with respect to ideological violence is that I believe it's important in understanding ideological violence and group formation, as Elias suggested, that individuals have very little free choice in their group identity and social habitus. So this speaks to this vague residue. These interconnected concepts that sociology held before, Elias really countered that, and he suggested that these changes and all circumstances in social life emerge from relationships between people, that people are not disconnected. So this was an important statement for him to make to really cement his theory. So particularly in his analysis of violence, it aligns to earlier ideas on radicalized individuals who have accepted social values, feeling they did not have access to fair and equitable process as maybe others do in society. And this is where the shift begins when you've rejected the social values and you feel as though there is no further avenue for you to discuss, present, or argue your agenda, irrespective of how it goes against society, that at that point, violence becomes the justifiable last measure. So employing Elias's theory, there are a number of important observations, three of which are these developments or social facts, they must be explainable. So when you're going into a process of using Elias's theory in a theory-guided research activity, it must be understood that they must have a detectable effect, and there has to be context and criteria associated with them. Also, there are regularities, meaning that some have an element of derived predictability and repeatability, and that they must be observable, meaning their criteria is fully defined and describable. So a little bit of a summary. So the civilizing process, as I presented to you, is a processual analysis of how society and the psychology of humans create social change over these long periods of time, and that these are seen essentially in human behaviors that are expressed through violence, conflict, various interactions, bonding values, that sort of thing. And these interactions, social figurations, these are reflected in the bonding and the grouping of humans. And Elias posited that these figurations develop this social habitus or codes, conditions, and over this long period of time, that going back to the 3 points that I just mentioned, that you can detect them, you can measure them, and there's some predictability and repeatability associated with them. So on this slide, just very quickly, so I did touch on this a little bit. Elias argued individuals have little free choice in group identity and social habitus. So these are persuasive and apparent only in hindsight. And the changing circumstances do not originate from outside, unconnected from people, but from between people. So to that, Elias argued two central sociological themes across all his major texts, so not only the civilizing process, and that is that long-term social connections manifest in and through power, behavior, emotions, and politics, and also through these evolving networks of interdependent humans. This next slide, sorry, I just lost my place here. So this next slide, Elias had stated that it is the order of interweaving human impulses and strivings, which determines the course of historical change, and that this underlies the civilizing process. So this statement provides a generalized summary of the civilizing process and how it encompasses that social level where humans figure prominently. Another quote by Elias that was also kind of telling, but I think it really shows how he views humans, and he has a very abstract perspective. So one of the things he said was, humans have a difficult time imagining that after their deaths, a world will be here. And I think that really speaks to how, as humans, we tend to think on the individual sociology level. So this is where you make that leap to the process level. So thinking in terms of processes by removing the humanities barrier. And that quote, to me, it really says something very interesting about how we approach current social problems, how we view the future, where we limit our imagination and our planning, and that also filters down through our bureaucracy and how our governments operate. So it was a really interesting quote for me to really sort of understand, to lift myself out of that micro layer and into the meso layer, and to only look at the processual aspects of social interactions, and without thinking about individuals in particular. This goes back to the earlier slide where I was suggesting that terrorism analysis needs to remove those elements of demographic and gender and status, so that we can see those processes, those social processes that may influence terrorist group activity and involvement.
I have a quick question, Valarie, for you, if you could.
Of course.
Yeah. How did you get, like, it seems like Elias is very centered into you doing your PhD. How did you get to select this actually person, and what was the process in which you thought of selecting this person?
It was interesting. I have a collection of odd books, and everything from Gödel, Escher, Bach. I've been very much an interdisciplinarian in terms of how I approach my academic career. And one of the books I had was The Civilizing Process. And I remember the first time I read it, I mean, literally, I think I got about a quarter of the way through it, and I was like, I have no idea what this is about. And I just could not see the applied purpose of his theory. So what I did was I picked up a few of his other major texts and started reading into it, and then I picked up the some of his earlier translations, and started to understand what I believe to be a very novel approach, because I think we're so focused on why things happen in the world, and the first place we go to in these types of incidents, specifically around violence, is we go right to the individual. And the more I understood Elias's approach, the more I understood what he was suggesting, is that we need to look up a layer. And that's what really appealed to me, because I feel as though and I'll talk a little bit about CPVE programs, so countering and preventing violent extremism programs, and how our governments have utilized these. There's so many issues, and for the decades upon decades that we've been looking at individual causality, we really haven't gotten anywhere. It's been very inconclusive. So it seemed logical to me to look in a different direction. And I think for me, it was just a constellation of things occurred that I was introduced to Elias. And the more I persisted in trying to understand his theory and simplify it so I could explain it to other people, the more committed I became to it. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I think that's how I arrived at looking at his process with a much cleaner eye and with you know, seeing much more value in it than maybe was expected. And I think one thing to keep in mind too is that Elias's works are very hard to understand, and this is one of the things I'll talk about on this slide. And in this world, and in my generation, we're not exactly known for patience. If we can't get it a couple times around, and we're not really that committed to it, we just put it aside. And I think Elias's works have sort of fallen victim to that, because it is a very complex intellectual study to really understand where he began with his theory and the theoretical concepts that spawned from it and where he was going with it. So I'll stop there if that answers the question.
Yeah.
But if
No, thank you, Valarie. I get a sense of where you're going with this. You know, philosophers can get very, very deep in the weeds. And yes, I mean, I understand your view about, you know, going from individuals to going from a broader concept of what caused things to happen. So yeah, thank you for the answer. Yeah, I mean, it's just that I've never heard of the guy before. I'm sorry, I'm not well read, but I did a master's degree in public ethics, and I had to read a lot of philosophers, and you know, a whole bunch of different views about philosophy. But okay, that's a different point of view. But then he's probably not the only guy in his camp, right? So there's probably other people that have this other bigger point of view that you probably have been looking at as well. I'm just thinking, but that's it. That's all.
yeah, and actually to that briefly, so Elias, and I'm biased, obviously, you know, we'll say Elias came into his academic career at a very interesting time. So in the 1900s, there was a lot going on, and he was a Polish Jew. He was born in Poland. He was exiled to France. So he definitely, and this was some of the bias that I attempted to remove from some of the theoretical concepts, and not necessarily remove, but maybe frame them correctly. But the interesting thing about Elias is he came into a period where, prior to this, at least from the philosophical perspective, the theological was the underpinnings of how we understood humans and how we understood what was going on. And then we saw this shift, and there was a true reformation that brought about what we refer to as the new sociology, and Elias certainly, I think, coined that phrase. And we moved more to metaphysical aspects of human behavior to explain why why we operate the way we do. So this was a really crucial time, because this was also the rejection of theology as it referred to sociology, or how it explained sociology, which was very controversial at the time, because I'm sure you remember the power of the church and how this formed society and class and structure. So he kind of entered at an interesting time. Not to say that there aren't other scholars, whether they're philosophers or sociologists, that contributed, and there certainly was a lot of borrowing and back and forth. You know, Durkheim and a number of others, they utilized Elias's work and vice versa. So there was compatible structure in some of these theories. So to that, I feel as though the importance of his work has been undermined to some extent, and that, you know, an essential revitalization that really hinges on being able to understand, to have someone explain to other scholars the value of his theory, so that they can understand and operationalize it and use it in an applied way. And I think that's the challenge across the board with a lot of the disciplines. So I'll talk a little bit about, this is how I came up with how to explain to people this whole concept of social figurations in an easy way, because it's easy to slide into, you know, either side, in either the individual or the macro, the state formation. So using the analogy of ripples in the water, this helps us illustrate the shift from social interactions to effects of social interactions. So drop pebbles in the water and they create ripples independent of the pebbles, and they impact with other ripples. So Elias's theory focuses on the process of ripples impacting ripples, not the pebbles. So the pebbles, we could argue those are the individuals. The ripples are the social interactions, and the collision of the ripples are the effects of those social interactions. Now, what can interfere with that? A number of things. If we're only talking about ripples in water right now, water can be affected by temperature, by barriers, by depth, by wind. And if you take those ideas and you shift them to the sociological side, those social conditions, there are going to be a number of different variables. That's what we're looking at in terms of social conditions. So what influences those social interactions or the effects of those social interactions? So I put together this illustration that I hope you can make out. And this gives a little bit of an idea of how the spiral in the middle, we use this a lot just to sort of show, you know, social movement, social interactions, but this sort of lays out some very specific phases, if you will, of Elias's theory. So if we look in the center, we've got at the bottom social interactions. So we see in this social interaction, these are individuals maybe interacting with one other individual. It's a very closed, these are their closest relationships. So there's self-regulation. This is that micro layer I was talking about. If you look up one, you'll see the social figurations. And these are where those people down there, they've grouped. So they've created their little groups. They've got, if you look over on the left, they've bonded, they've got social habitus, which is the group standard. They have social codes, identity, and social features. And then you go up another layer, we still have social figurations. So you're spinning upwards, and then you have larger groups. And this is where the state formation, nation formation occurs. If you look to the right, you'll see this is where nation identity is evidenced. And Elias talks about that a lot in his book, The Germans. So this illustration kind of helps us get our head around all the things that are on the table when we talk about social figurations. So these social elements, how they relate to each other, and what they mean in the greater context. So Elias countered that human psychology was static and unchanging, and aimed to show how human emotions and psychological dispositions change over time. Most importantly, in the context of ideological violence, how they are shaped by changing social conditions and relationships. So we're looking at, with respect to ideological violence, what are those changing social conditions and relationships around those group formations? So again, we're talking about that center swirl. Identifying a long-term trend for external social constraint that was incorporated into individuals' habitus as internal psychological and emotional constraints. Elias noted this process was blind and unplanned, and designed and pursued by no one, but a real and consequential process of social transformation. So how can that be? How can something be blind, unplanned? There's no particular pursuit, nobody's driving it forward, but it has this consequential impact to social transformation. This is the crux of becoming to understand Elias's theory, accepting that it is a blind, unplanned process, but that it has a profound effect. And it is that controlled chaos or controlled randomness that, when you're in that mindset and understanding the theory, that really crystallizes some of those concepts. So Elias's conceptual positions are, and I'll read you three that are particularly important, are that all social life can be understood as the unintended outcome of interwoven intentional human actions. Second, he was critical of what he called homoklausis, so the conception of human beings, that people were closed and autonomous entities. So instead, as mentioned, he argued that human beings were interdependent, forming figurations or networks with each other that connect to the psychological, to the social, and then to the habitus of social relations. So his concept of figuration is very closely related to Pierre Bourdieu's concept of field. And he duly emphasized the importance of the concept of habitus in the sense of socially structured psychological and emotional disposition. So again, back to what I was saying earlier, other scholars, they certainly have used some of these theoretical concepts back and forth, and so did Elias. And thirdly, Elias insisted that an adequate understanding of any social scientific object of analysis, whether it be individuals, groups, social institutions, or organizations, depends on grasping their relationships with each other, rather than attempting to analyze them as discrete entities. That statement there, again, that moves us away from the individual analysis, the psychological analysis, and moves us over to this collective of understanding the relationships between entities as opposed to the entity itself. So they must be examined as dynamic processes of development and change rather than static structures. So in this slide, a couple more points just on how Elias saw or implemented or suggested some of his arguments around his theoretical concepts. So Elias described the double sociogenesis, the mental and the political, that was relied upon by social development and group formation. So this originating at the individual psychic level, the mental is attached to the individual habitus that transforms through social interactions into the social habitus and social codes. So in this statement, this is where we're making that break from the individual into the meso layer, so the social grouping layer, and that this is that process view that we are trying to maintain. How the individual thinks and feels privately may be expressed differently in group interactions. Again, this is where we want to be in terms of understanding how they are in the group, because how they think and feel privately may be completely different than how they demonstrate or how they verbalize that in a group. And it may never change in that person. Maybe it may change over time, but how I feel inside about something, or maybe with my closest of friends, I may not admit that, or I may not take action on that in a group, and vice versa. So it's interesting because it becomes this transitory state of where the social habitus forms, and this is where the political emerges. So stirring debate among scholars, Elias introduced the idea that the becoming of humans was not isolated or autonomous. So it is this order of interweaving human impulses and strivings, a social order which determines the course of historical change. As these web of actions form complex systems of figurations, they are observable as social processes of individuals and groups, such as collaboration, bonding, and conflict. And they are constrained by social controls that manifest as an unconscious apparatus. These social figurations facilitate the intricate, unplanned symbiosis that develops between humans. So just very quickly there, the constrained by social controls. So this is where we get into some of the more specific areas of other theories when we look at things like pacification. So institutional imposed social controls are one thing, self-regulation is another. So they're both at either end of the spectrum. So the self-regulation is at the individual layer. And this is the self-imposed control through your own regulation. We're not interested in that. We want to look at the social controls that are imposed by groups and what makes an individual act with the group because it is socially expected or socially accepted by the group. Sorry, I should never play around with the PowerPoint features. Yes, I think we covered that. So Elias's civilization referred to reformist goals and systemic social regularities from the French Reform. So this was his template for the civilization process. So when we talk about civilization, specifically Elias's civilization, this isn't an end point. So, and we went through that in a few slides back where we talked about this being a blind process, it's unplanned. So civilization does not, in Elias's words, does not indicate any kind of advancement or progress. It's really a waging between two ends. So establishing the process, establishing what the normative frame is, and then where it moves from that back and forth between civilizing and decivilizing. So there has been a pejorative associated with when you hear civilizing or civilization, that this is better. But in Elias's words, and some of this I think was lost in the translation because civilization in German does not have the same meaning as civilization in Western nations, in English. So civility, also a term that he used, was this demarcation of courtly behaviors between the French, English, and German circles from the rest of society. So that civility in this case was the polar opposite of barbarism. So again, it just goes to show some of the intricacies, the subtleties in understanding Elias's intention through his theory so that you can successfully apply it. So again, civilization and civilizing, it's not the maturation of a nation or value or cultural judgment. It is the fluid, unplanned, unconscious to the individual transformation with no known objective and decivilizing processes. So this is the receding or regression of a social process and the subject social process that you're examining. Social figurations, so these are it's the social change and conditions that emerge from relationships between people, not outside of people, creating widespread social change seen in long-term social developments. And habitus, this develops from bonding, grouping, and interactions. It is the accepted point in time, social standards that change over time, but that are not unique to an individual. So they are unique to the group. So individual habitus out of scope, social habitus in scope, and relates to the group itself. So individuals have little free choice in the social habitus experienced by the group. So this sort of speaks to the influence and the coerciveness of the collective or the group on the individuals that will shift you towards certain behaviors and certain ways of thinking because you have that collective behind you, because and it could be a negative or positive, it could be coercive, or it could be a positive supportive experience. So again, we have individuals interacting, grouping and bonding, so the formation of grouping and bonding, which develops social habitus and social codes, which results in social figurations, and that this over long periods of time will develop social change, and that this is where you can identify these processes that are civilizing or decivilizing, and then we have the percolate up to state formation. So I'll talk a little bit about obviously the synthesis of ideological violence and social figurations. I think I've probably completely overloaded you with Norbert Elias and his social figurations. So the purpose of the research that I've been engaged in is to take a look at ideological violence in a way that we're not normally accustomed to doing so. So again, past research on ideological violence, and I can go through the entire list of incredible scholars who've contributed amazing work. Martha Crenshaw is one of my favorites, and she's done some excellent work on not only various elements of terrorism, but specifically around single causality related to terrorism. And this was way back in the 70s. So, we had a very different view of terrorism at that time. And, we were trying to make determinations, is it poverty? Is it lack of education? Is it social standing? Is it gender? Is it race? There were so many things that we wanted to rule out because we really wanted a solution. We wanted to know how we could mitigate the effects of terrorist grouping. So focus on the individual rather than social figurations, interactions, grouping, and bonding. So we've always gone to the individual to make those assessments. Also focus on the analysis of a singular concept, and I would argue that knowing what we know really about all social problems these days, there are precious little that have a single causal element, that there is nothing else that influences them. So, we've typically, as mentioned, we looked at social demographics, political, geographic, and economic destabilization as general high-level causal areas, all to no effect. The countering and preventing violent extremism programs, which is my applied focus, the reason I'm so concerned about this, or that I've focused in on this, is that this is exactly what CPV programs use. So they use this concept of individual assessments and profiling to identify risk behaviors. And they have come under fire, and these are predominantly government programs, whether federal or all the way down to local, which could be community or law enforcement. They're largely ineffective, poorly formulated, and often violate human and civil rights. So if we think back to when these programs were brought in, it was almost immediately after 9/11, and it came in with a whole raft of legislation in the US and Canada to deal with terrorism in particular, global terrorism at that time. So there's an argument that these programs, they're systemically racist. They were specifically crafted to address what was at the time, and I think reasonably so, Muslim-related activities and certainly terrorist activities, where this creates a problem because the ideological violence, concept of ideological violence, we can't have such a fine point on it that our programs are only focused in on certain types of individuals that look a certain way or are from a particular background or from a particular country. So the value proposition in using that middle layer, that social grouping layer, as an element of developing research to look at how we change social policy, how social policy may or may not be able to either prevent or preempt, bring forward information around how these social conditions may result in civil uprisings or domestic terror actions. Oh, there we go. So again, the problem the applied research aims to address, countering and preventing violent extremism programs. So just very quickly, they've been criticized for employing controversial techniques largely rejected by academics. There's been misuse of the programs for surveillance and informant recruiting. There's been charges of racial bias targeting Muslim population, refugees, and immigrants. The psychological criteria that is used in these assessments are very unsophisticated and often rely on simple proxies such as individual religiosity, political activism, and very superficial things like feelings of alienation and hopelessness, futility. And the problem with this is that this can potentially brand these people that they're assessing wrongly as at-risk individuals. So people that are at risk of radicalized behavior or radicalization itself. So how do we develop a framework to synthesize processual sociology and ideological violence? So I'm just going to skip forward here because I think I'm going to end up running a little bit over time. I do just want to talk back to one particular slide. So, so one of the more interesting statements that was made, Hughes and Dunning both were very committed to Elias and his theory, and they spent a great deal of time not only translating but also interpreting some of his concepts in one-to-one interviews with him. So with respect to the work that I'm focused on, so allowing his theory to guide the research, ideological violence and group formation, this occurs without substantive free choice by the individual in their group identity and social habitus. So this, I believe, becomes quite important when we're looking at the formation of terrorist groups, and to some extent how they do their recruitment. And that, again, changing circumstances, they don't originate outside, unconnected from people, but from the relationships between people. And it's these concepts that are key in understanding the sociogenesis of ideological violence and how it may influence individuals who radicalize or that feel that violence is the only way to move their agenda forward. So in this concept, radicalized individuals, they've rejected the accepted social values, and for whatever reason, they perceive, it may not be real, but they perceive that they no longer have access to fair and equitable processes as others do in society. So, and this again promotes violence to a justifiable action. So conceptually, it may be argued that ideological violence develops from social standards that have mutated from the accepted social habitus and through unconscious formulation. And this was an observation made by Hughes and Dunning in 2013. And again, for the individual, this goes undetected with nothing remaining in their consciousness except, as Elias had said, a vague residue. So Stephen Vertigans, who also studied Elias's concepts, he argued that ongoing and recent terrorism emerges out of environments where the pacification of behavior norms and emotions has been interrupted. So that interruption, it could be partial, or it could just lack longevity. And in other words, the processes of pacification, they're no longer robust and normative. So what is thought to be desirable. So uncritically, they're internalized over generations. So what does this mean? If we look back at Rigeco's general theory of pacification, he had argued that there were three overlapping strata, and I won't get into these because they're very, very detailed, but it's essentially dispossession, exploitation, and commodification. And this pacification, this could be military, political, economic, social processes, and this pacification becomes a sub-process or a strategic approach that's often seen in imperialism. So if we deduce that when processes of pacification are not complete in their breadth and depth, irrespective of what type they are, the integrity and legitimacy of the process is destroyed and the effect is lost. And this allows an opening. So this allows the potential for some type of social uprising, some kind of alternate ideology. And it's in this fallibility that a small segment may reject the social values and develop that alternate ideology or value system. But this and Vertigans' assertion may only be part of a very complicated multi-causal story. Going back to earlier comments I made about we have to keep our eyes off of these singular causal aspects and keep our minds open to these other processes that could be providing influences. So sorry, I'm just going to move forward here a bit. So the processual approach, in my opinion, is key. This is based on the presumption that all of the social elements and their outcomes are always manifesting as processes. So they're always creating, recreating, and undoing by regression at every given moment. So this differs from the focus on the individual, where there is distinct and isolated behaviors and actions, so a true cause and effect, that are presumed to be the catalyst for short-term change that may lend itself to long-term change. The process view is arguing that it is these processes of creating and recreating and undoing that are really making the long-term changes that we're most concerned with. So to that, the core of Elias's civilizing process theory is of particular interest to the phenomenon of ideological violence because, as he stated, social life and the world around us are natural reflections of human tendencies, emerging from social interactions and social bonding and creating social habitus, social codes, and group identity. This thought is a reflection of social life with the humanities barrier removed. Again, going back to that concept of pulling away from the individual elements. Lastly, I will leave you with this. This is one of my favorite depictions of interactions, social figurations by Elias. So Elias describes social figurations as a dance. A dance can be any style, a tango, a waltz, rock and roll, but it remains a dance. Dancers may join in, sit out, re-engage, or leave, but the dance continues with unplanned structure and process. So while independent of any one dancer, what Elias is saying is the dance is not independent of the faceless, identity-free collective, those who come together. So I always found this to be a vivid metaphor because it really suggests that these figurations sort of float alternately above and beneath an imaginary line between the individual and a group, and that this is a simultaneous, unplanned yet structured aspect that Elias has tried to put forward. And I will stop there.
Well, thank you, Valarie. I might ask immediately, just to get the conversation going, where do you see this leading? I mean, is Elias, is he a thought leader that many others are starting to embrace? And where does that sort of fit in going into the future? You're on mute.
I think honestly, it's coming in dribs and drabs. Elias has the Elias community, and there really is one, is very interesting because we have a number of scholars who knew Elias, and this is sort of like the first generation of scholars who were committed to his theory.
You can stop the recording now, Samir, if you're with us.